All right, today we are diving into a really complex and honestly pretty provocative theological text from Myung Moon called Lineage of God. It lays out this incredibly unique vision of human history, sin, and what salvation actually means. So let's get right into it.
Wow, talk about an opening statement. The entire text, everything we're about to go through, is basically built to solve the problem in that one sentence. The idea here isn't just that humans do bad things. No, it goes way deeper. The argument is that our very lineage, our spiritual bloodline, is corrupted, that we inherited it from Satan, not from God.
So before we can even begin to understand the solution this text proposes, we have to get our heads around the full scale of the problem it's describing. This first part is all about what it calls the satanic lineage. What you're seeing here is this stark contrast. The core argument is that human history basically took a wrong turn at the very beginning. So instead of being born into God's family, living in His love, humanity was born into the family of His enemy. This created this massive chasm, a separation that, according to the text, defines our entire reality. And that leads us to the absolute central concept of this whole thing: restoration. See, it's not just about asking for forgiveness for something you did wrong. It's about a complete reversal of history itself, a process to fundamentally change our spiritual DNA from satanic all the way back to divine. Okay, so if that's the massive problem, what's the solution? Well, the text lays out this long, painful, and super detailed plan from God's side. It calls it the providence of restoration. Let's see how this whole argument is built. This quote just paints such a vivid picture, doesn't it? It gets to a core theme here: God's own suffering. The text doesn't portray God as some distant, detached king. No, it's the image of a heartbroken parent who has been grieving for thousands of years over his lost kids. And here's a crucial point. This restoration, it isn't free. The text brings in this principle of indemnity. You can think of it like a spiritual debt that has to be paid back. This is the explanation for why history is so full of hardship and sacrifice. It's all part of paying the price to reverse that initial fall. So how is that debt paid? Well, here's the mechanism. The text says that for salvation to happen, you need a champion. You need an able figure, someone who is on God's side to pay that price on behalf of all the fallen Cain figures, which is basically the rest of us. Now, this whole idea of needing a champion really sets the stage for the next chapter of the story. History, in this view, becomes this long sequence of different people chosen by God to lay the foundation, piece by painstaking piece, for that ultimate restoration. The text takes us on a tour through biblical history, pointing out this chain of key figures it calls God's champions. It starts with Abel, whose sacrifice was tragically cut short. Then you have Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses. Each one of them had to endure these immense personal sacrifices, and the text argues that each one successfully laid down one more piece of the foundation for the next person to build on. I mean, let's just zoom in on Noah for a second. The text calls his mission incomprehensible. And you can see why, right? Why would you build a giant boat on a mountain? The point, it argues, is that God's test of faith has to be absolute. It requires you to obey even when it makes zero logical sense and makes you look like a fool to everyone around you. And then you have Jacob. His trial wasn't just some symbolic thing. The text describes a literal, physical, all-night brawl with an angel. Think about that. Even after he's seriously injured, he refuses to let go. This is meant to show the kind of ferocious, unyielding determination it takes to actually win God's blessing and change your destiny. So you start to see a pattern here. According to the text, these champions were not popular people. They didn't live comfortable lives. They were isolated, they were persecuted, and they lived completely for a purpose that was way bigger than themselves, all defined by this absolute and often totally illogical faith in God. So all of this history, all of these champions and all their sacrifices, they're all leading up to one central figure, the Messiah. But the text argues that his mission was fundamentally different from anyone who came before. And this is really the key question that this whole section tries to answer. I mean, you have these incredible figures like Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad. So what makes Jesus Christ unique within this very specific theological framework? So the text's answer is that it all comes down to lineage. It argues that while other founders were brilliant and accomplished amazing things, they were still born from the fallen human bloodline.
Jesus, it claims, is different. Because of a really complex history involving some very unconventional acts by women in his ancestry, like Tamar, his lineage was pre-cleansed of satanic influence, and that gave him the unique qualification to remove original sin.
And this quote is used to illustrate just how profoundly isolated he was. By not calling her mother, the text says Jesus was signaling that his mission separated him even from his own family. It put him in this incredibly lonely position where he was fundamentally misunderstood, even by the people closest to him. Now here's the major twist in the story. The crucifixion, according to this text, was not the complete fulfillment of God's plan. The argument is that because the people of his time failed to unite with him and help establish a new foundation on earth, his victory was limited to the spiritual world. The physical world was left still needing restoration. And that brings us to the final section, which really shifts the focus from the past right into the present. Okay, so if Jesus' work was left incomplete, what happens now? Well, the text argues that the responsibility, it falls on us.
This quote really captures the heart of the call to action. It's not about passively waiting around to be saved. The pressure is on believers to actively change themselves to move towards God and Jesus, not the other way around. And here's what that change is supposed to look like. The text calls for believers to think way beyond just their own personal salvation and to take on a global responsibility. It demands unity across all the different denominations and a willingness to become a collective, living sacrifice, which means a unified, active community that's willing to pay the price to finish the work that Jesus started.
And this leads to a really powerful and kind of radical conclusion. The role of the Messiah gets democratized. The text says the title of Messiah isn't just for one person in history. It's the responsibility of every single believer who looks at the world and sees that it needs saving.
And so, this is where we're left. By framing salvation not as something that happened 2,000 years ago, but as an ongoing, collective responsibility, the text leaves us with a really provocative question. If a unified, living sacrifice is what's required to restore the world, what does that actually look like for us today?